General Hospital will reveal the weight pressing down on Sasha's shoulders as she stepped into the courtroom was almost unbearable, each breath a battle against the swell of dread that rose within her. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the whispers that followed her every step like a cold breeze through stained glass. She wore a loose-fitting dress in an attempt to hide the size of her belly, but there was no concealing the truth any longer. Every movement she made was laced with trembling restraint, every glance she returned filled with panic hiding behind the thin veil of composure. The gavel had not yet fallen, yet Sasha already felt judged, not by the court, but by fate itself. She wasn't just a witness summoned to speak in a contentious custody hearing between Michael and Willow, she was the bearer of a truth capable of collapsing the entire narrative carefully constructed by both parties. The child growing inside her was not the son or daughter of Jason, as so many in the courtroom had assumed for months. No, the baby was Michael's, the result of a single night that two broken souls had spent together in the wake of pain too overwhelming to face alone. That night had been their escape, a mistake perhaps, but also the only moment of clarity in a storm of grief. Sasha had carried that secret like a ticking time bomb, its silence louder with every heartbeat. She had agonized over the consequences, telling the truth would either be the sword that severs Michael's hopes of gaining custody or the key to winning it entirely. She had tried to believe silence was the nobler path, protecting everyone from another layer of scandal. But now, summoned to the stand, under the scrutiny of lawyers, judges, and estranged family members, she could feel the walls of deception closing in. Rick entered the courtroom like a predator scenting blood, his expression cold and clinical, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a coming kill. He didn't need a confession, he needed a crack, the smallest fracture in Sasha's armor, and he would exploit it without mercy. His questions came hard and fast, slicing through the air like razors. He dug into her past, her associations, the timeline of her pregnancy, and then into the relationship she once had with Michael. Sasha faltered. Her voice, already frail, began to shake. Her heart thundered in her chest as Rick circled closer, verbal knives unsheathed. Her attempts to deflect grew weaker, her hands gripped the edges of the witness stand like lifelines. Rick could smell the truth, it hovered in the air, waiting for the final blow. Then it came, the final question. He demanded to know who the father of her unborn child was. A silence descended, not unlike the stillness before a bomb detonates. All eyes locked on Sasha, and in that moment, the weight of months of secrecy collapsed. Her lips trembled as she uttered the one name that would change everything, Michael. The impact was instantaneous. A wave of gasps, murmurs, and accusations filled the courtroom like a gathering storm. Michael sat in stunned silence, Willow stiffened as if her body had frozen mid-thought, and even Jason, stoic and unreadable, narrowed his eyes. But before the shock could settle into anger, something even more catastrophic happened. Sasha's face twisted in agony as her hands flew to her belly. Her knees buckled, and she let out a cry, sharp, primal, and filled with terror. The courtroom, still buzzing with disbelief, was thrown into chaos as she collapsed to the floor. Paralyzed by pain, Sasha could barely speak. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps as the air around her seemed to thicken with dread. Panic rippled across the room. Paramedics were called immediately. Within minutes, the courtroom became a blur of movement and alarm. The judge called for a recess, but no one listened. Michael raced to Sasha's side, his hands trembling as he held hers, now cold and clammy. Her eyes sought his, terrified and pleading, as she whispered that it was too soon, the baby was not ready. Her body shook with the force of contractions that arrived far too early, and her pain was no longer just physical. It was the terror of losing another child. Outside, the wail of sirens echoed through the courthouse corridors, piercing the hearts of those who knew Sasha's story. She had already lost a child before, Liam, her first son, born too early and taken too soon. The memory of his tiny face, still and lifeless, haunted her every time she touched her growing stomach. She had sworn to herself that this time would be different, that she would protect this baby with everything she had left. But now, with fate once again playing a cruel hand, her world began to unravel before she could hold that promise in her arms. Michael did not let go of her for even a second as she was lifted onto the gurney. His voice, hoarse and broken, whispered her name again and again, as if saying it would tether her to this world. The chaos around them faded into the background. There was only Sasha, fighting a battle against time and trauma, and Michael, praying in silence for a miracle he wasn't sure he deserved. He had betrayed Willow. He had created a life in the shadow of lies. But none of it mattered now, only Sasha, and the tiny life inside her, did. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the courtroom was left in stunned silence. Rick stood off to the side, his victory already soured by the sudden descent into tragedy. Willow sat motionless, grappling with the feeling of having lost everything in a matter of minutes, her relationship, her pride, and now, perhaps, her ability to keep her family whole. As the ambulance raced through Port Charles, Sasha's condition grew worse. The contractions were too close, her blood pressure dropping, her body weakening. Doctors were ready for her arrival, already preparing for an emergency cesarean, but they knew the risks were monumental. Sasha was fragile, both physically and emotionally, and she was already fighting on borrowed strength. Yet even as her vision blurred and her consciousness flickered, she clung to one final image, Michael holding their baby, smiling, safe. It was all she wanted. And as the hospital lights overwhelmed her senses, she let go, not in fear, but in faith. And when the doctors emerged with the child, crying but alive, everyone knew, Sasha had given everything to bring him into the world. She never opened her eyes again. At the hospital, chaos blended seamlessly with urgency as a team of obstetricians and trauma surgeons assembled within seconds. Sasha was rushed through the corridors under flashing emergency lights, the wheels of her gurney rattling against the sterile floor as monitors beeped ominously. The staff worked with rapid precision, for lines were inserted, oxygen administered, vitals monitored with hawk-like intensity. Michael remained at her side, clutching her cold hand, whispering her name in between shallow, desperate breaths of his own. The surgical team prepped for an emergency C-section, their expressions a careful blend of focus and grim acknowledgement of the stakes. Time was the enemy now. As the scalpel made its first incision, Sasha drifted in and out of consciousness, the anesthesia lulling her into a half-world between pain and oblivion. Her body, weakened by the shock of sudden labor and prolonged stress, trembled beneath the sheet. Nurses shouted vitals back and forth, blood pressure plummeting by the second. The baby's heart rate fluctuated dangerously, but the surgeons pressed on, racing the cruel countdown of two fragile lives balanced on the edge of fate. Then, at last, a sound, faint at first, then rising, wavering but undeniable, the cry of a newborn echoed through the surgical wing. A nurse raised the baby gently, cradling him as another team rushed to clean and assess his condition. He was small, his limbs thin and barely formed, skin a fragile shade of crimson, but he cried, and that cry was a declaration of life amidst the storm. Michael broke down, falling to his knees in relief and agony all at once. Tears poured from his eyes as he whispered a silent thank you to the woman lying on the table, still and pale, the mother who had given everything. But joy was a cruel visitor that day, fleeting, fragile, and swiftly overshadowed. The lead surgeon turned to the nurses with a grave tone, announcing that Sasha's bleeding was uncontrollable. Despite transfusions, despite every emergency measure taken, the hemorrhaging could not be stopped. Michael was pulled aside and warned of the worst. He refused to listen at first, refusing to believe that after everything, after the sacrifices and strength Sasha had shown, this was how her story would end. For over an hour, the team fought to save her. They worked tirelessly, hands moving with mechanical speed, faces slick with sweat beneath surgical masks. Michael prayed. He bargained with whatever higher power might be listening. He begged for more time, for one more miracle. But then, at 2:47 a.m., Sasha's heart monitor flatlined. Her pulse was gone. And just like that, a silence fell over the operating room, not from a lack of sound, but from the heavy realization that the battle had been lost. Sasha died quietly, her hand slipping from Michael's without a sound. Her soul, exhausted by trauma and sacrifice, faded into the silence of the sterile room. There was no final word, no parting gesture. Just the stillness of a woman who had given everything to bring another life into the world. Her son lay in a neonatal incubator only feet away, connected to machines that breathed for him, fought for him, and kept him alive in the absence of the mother who had once carried him with such fierce love. The news of Sasha's death swept across Port Charles like a toxic wind, freezing time for those who had known her. People who had watched her battle through addiction, loss, and unbearable grief now mourned the final chapter of a life defined not by tragedy alone, but by unrelenting resilience. She had lost her first child. She had lost Brando. She had survived a breakdown in the harsh light of the public eye. And just when it seemed she might begin again, she vanished, leaving behind a child, a man, and a community forever changed. Michael became a fixture in the neonatal intensive care unit, a silent guardian beside the incubator that housed his son. He didn't speak much. He didn't sleep. He didn't leave. Every day, he stood by that glass barrier, watching the tiny movements of the boy who bore so much weight in his existence. He named him Liam, in honor of the child Sasha had lost years ago. Not just as a tribute, but as a way of binding past and present, so that Sasha's legacy would stretch across both children, both losses, and both chances at redemption. His days blurred into one another, doctor's updates, soft lullabies whispered into the hum of machines, moments when he placed his hand on the glass as if to say, "I'm here." It wasn't just grief that consumed Michael. It was awe. Awe at the strength Sasha had carried, at the pain she had endured, and at the life she had given him, even in her death. Willow, upon hearing the news, was frozen in disbelief. She had imagined betrayal, she had imagined courtroom humiliation, but she had never imagined death. Sasha's passing erased the pettiness of jealousy and the bitterness of betrayal. It swept away her anger like a tide. The woman she had viewed as a rival had laid down her life. Not for Michael, not even for herself, but for a child she would never hold. Willow came to the hospital unannounced, alone. She didn't speak when she arrived, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She stood silently outside the NICU, watching through the glass as Michael gently lifted Liam into his arms for the first time without the haze of surgical wires and tubes. His eyes were red-rimmed, face hollow, but his hands were steady as he cradled the newborn against his chest. In that moment, Willow saw not the man who had betrayed her, but the man who had lost everything. A man reshaped by grief, tethered to a son who would never know his mother's embrace. There was no need for confrontation. No room for bitterness. There was only compassion, and a fragile peace that came with the realization that sometimes love takes forms we don't understand, and sacrifices we never anticipated. Sasha's death had ended a chapter, but it had also begun something new. A silent promise that her child would be protected, nurtured, and loved, no matter what. And so, in that quiet room, beneath the soft hum of machines and the breath of a sleeping infant, Michael whispered to his son, a promise carved in sorrow and love, bound in silence and memory, "You will know her, through me." Rick stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, arms crossed, lips pursed in a tight line that betrayed both satisfaction and something far more conflicted simmering beneath the surface. In the immediate aftermath of Sasha's confession, that Michael was the father of her child, Rick had felt a surge of triumph so intense it almost made him forget he was playing with real lives. He had orchestrated the moment flawlessly, using Nina's whispered doubts and exploiting Sasha's fragile emotional state until the truth came crashing down like a thunderclap across the courtroom. It was, on paper, the decisive blow meant to shatter Michael's credibility and dismantle any chance he had at securing full custody. But victory had never felt this hollow. Mere minutes after Sasha uttered Michael's name, the courtroom turned into a scene of panic, pain, and desperate pleas for help. Sasha's collapse wasn't a dramatic outburst, it was real, terrifying, and final. Rick had seen many trials in his career, but never had he watched a witness fall to the ground writhing in agony, never had he watched a truth so lethal it caused a woman to go into labor and then die delivering her child. The grim truth weighed down on him as news of Sasha's death swept through the courthouse like a tidal wave. The woman he had forced to confess had paid for it with her life. He hadn't intended for this. For all his ruthlessness in the courtroom, Rick wasn't a monster. And yet, as he watched reporters swarm the courthouse steps, as he heard whispers of how brave Sasha had been, how tragically noble her sacrifice was, he realized he had lost more than he had gained. Instead of shaming Michael, he had turned him into a sympathetic hero, a grieving single father who had just lost the mother of his child. The tide of public opinion turned fast. Journalists no longer asked if Michael was an unfit parent, they asked how he would manage alone. Former allies of Willow softened, some even withdrew their support. Even the presiding judge, visibly shaken by the events in court, was now looking at Michael through a lens of compassion. The legal advantage Rick had clawed so viciously for was slipping from his fingers with every tribute written about Sasha's courage, every social media post calling her a martyr, every community member who left flowers outside the hospital in her honor. The courtroom had not yet delivered its ruling, but it hardly mattered now. Everyone, from lawyers to court clerks to spectators in the gallery, knew the balance had shifted. Michael wasn't just the biological father of the child. He was now a widower, a man reeling from heartbreak and facing single parenthood under a national spotlight. That truth was far more powerful than any closing argument Rick could give. As Rick sat alone in his office later that night, he scrolled through the headlines flooding the internet. A mother's final act of love, from heartache to heroism, Sasha's last gift, Michael Corinthos, fatherhood forged in grief. One photo stood out. Michael, cradling his premature son in the neonatal unit, forehead pressed to the incubator glass, tears running freely. Rick stared at the image longer than he expected to, and for the first time in years, he questioned what he had become. Was he still pursuing justice? Or had he lost himself in the mechanics of winning, forgetting that real people lived, and died, by the consequences of his ambition? Sasha's death didn't just crack open the court case. It rippled through all of Port Charles like an emotional earthquake. Her name, once associated with scandal, addiction, and tragedy, was now uttered with reverence and sorrow. This was the woman who had overcome a deadly spiral of loss, from the death of her first child to the murder of her husband, only to rise again, quietly, and fight for what was right in the only way she knew how. Her love for Michael had not been flamboyant, nor manipulative, it had been silent, patient, unwavering. In her final days, she had not sought recognition or reward. She had simply chosen to tell the truth, despite knowing it might destroy her. And it did. But it also delivered justice, not the kind measured in legal victories, but the kind etched into the fabric of human hearts. The child Sasha left behind wasn't just a newborn, he was a legacy. A living testament to resilience. To bravery. To a woman who had been knocked down more times than anyone should, but who had always gotten back up. Until the very end, when she gave everything so that someone else could live. That child, Liam, now bore more than her name, he carried her story. A story of redemption and sacrifice, of imperfect love made beautiful through courage. For Michael, there would be no forgetting. His grief settled into him like a second skin. The silence of his home felt unbearable. The scent of Sasha's favorite lavender oil still lingered on a pillow she never returned to. But every time he looked at his son, every time those tiny eyes blinked up at him, searching for comfort, he remembered why Sasha had fought. Why she had stood in court. Why she had not run when it became too much. Her love had never been loud, but it had been absolute. And now, through his tears and his exhaustion, Michael promised to pass that love on, to raise Liam not as a burden, but as a blessing. To let his son grow up knowing that his mother had been a fighter. A protector. A hero. And for poor Charles, Sasha's death became a mirror. A chance to reflect on how easily people judged, how quickly they condemned. Her legacy forced the community to reckon with the fact that strength doesn't always look like perfection, and that some of the greatest acts of love come in the quietest, most painful forms. In the end, Sasha didn't win awards or accolades. She didn't get the future she dreamed of. But she gave someone else a future. And in doing so, she transcended the scars of her past, leaving behind something pure and unbreakable, a son, a memory, and a love strong enough to echo through generations.